What if the first Europeans to reach North America did not come to conquer it but to quietly test its limits and then walk away? This film explores the real story of the Vikings in North America, why their presence was brief yet profound, and why their retreat may matter more than their arrival. For centuries, this story existed in a grey zone between legend and disbelief. Today, archaeology, climate science, and genetics have forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Norse reached the New World 500 years before Columbus and still failed to stay. Understanding why reveals not just something about the Vikings, but something deeper about how human societies expand, hesitate, and sometimes choose restraint over empire. For much of modern scholarship, the Vinland sagas occupied an uneasy space between literature and history. Written in Iceland, centuries after the events they describe, they were shaped by oral tradition, selective memory, and time itself. To historians trained in critical analysis, that was a serious problem. These were not contemporary records. They were recollections passed down across generations. From an academic standpoint, such sources appeared dangerous. The stories were vivid, the figures heroic, the outcomes often flattering to Norse identity. Everything about them suggested embellishment. For decades, the safest response was skepticism, if not outright dismissal. And yet, within the sagas lay details that resisted easy rejection. Their descriptions were not fantastical. They spoke of lands west of Greenland in practical terms. Forests rich in timber, coastlines suitable for landing ships, winters mild enough to endure. They described unfamiliar people, not as monsters or spirits, but as human communities. These were not the markers of mythic worlds. They were logistical observations, the kind remembered by sailors, the kind valued by settlers. For a long time, this contradiction remained unresolved. The sagas were too imprecise to trust, yet too specific to ignore, and it was this tension between doubt and detail that would eventually force historians to reconsider them. Because stories born purely of imagination rarely concern themselves with where a ship can land or whether a winter can be survived. In the early 1960s, at the windswept northern edge of Newfoundland, a quiet discovery began to dismantle centuries of doubt. Beneath layers of peat and compacted soil, archaeologists uncovered low turf walls that did not belong to local indigenous traditions. Nearby lay fragments of worked iron and slag from smelting materials that immediately signaled an unfamiliar technological presence. The site became known as Lance aux Meadows, and its significance was unmistakable. The iron had been produced locally, not traded in. A bloomery furnace proved that ore had been smelted on site, a process unknown among indigenous cultures of the region at that time. This alone placed the settlement firmly within a Norse technological world. The architecture confirmed it. Timber frames packed with sod, long halls arranged around communal space, workshops suited for carpentry and boat repair. The layouts mirrored known sites in Greenland and Iceland, matching them not in style but in function. For the first time, the Vinland sagas were no longer stories seeking proof. The proof had emerged from the ground itself. Archaeology had done what literature could not. It anchored memory to material reality. With Lance aux Meadows, the debate shifted. The question was no longer whether the Vikings reached North America. That fact was settled. What remained was deeper and more unsettling. Why they came, how they used this place, and why their presence so deliberate yet so brief ultimately vanished. North America, it turned out, did have a Viking chapter, and it was written not in ink, but in earth and iron. The westward journey that eventually carried the Norse to Vinland was never conceived as a heroic act of exploration. It unfolded as a series of cautious extensions, each built upon hard-earned knowledge of the North Atlantic. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, the pattern remained the same. Sail only where currents were understood. Travel within seasonal limits, expand no farther than survival allowed. Each migration was not a leap into the unknown, but a controlled adjustment of distance. The Norse were not explorers in the romantic sense. They were logisticians of the sea. Their ships followed latitudes, not dreams. Decisions were governed by wind, ice, and the narrow margin between endurance and disaster. Vinland was never a destination imagined in advance. It existed at the outer edge of a system already stretched thin. Greenland itself was precarious, dependent on trade and favorable summers. Beyond it lay uncertainty, not opportunity. When Leif Erikson sailed around the year 1000, he did so in response to information. Reports of unfamiliar coastlines, driftwood that could not have come from Greenland, quiet signs that land existed where none should have been. Timber was scarce. Land meant wood. Wood meant survival. Vinland was not found because someone dared greatly. It was found because something did not belong a coastline where there should have been only open water. In that sense, Vinland emerged not from ambition, but from error. What the Norse encountered in North America was not an empty world waiting to be claimed. It was a living landscape, already shaped by human movement and memory. South of Newfoundland, the environment changed rapidly. Dense forests replaced the sparse Greenlandic terrain. Rivers cut deep into the land, offering access far beyond the coast. Archaeological evidence reveals resources unfamiliar to the Norse world. Wild grapes grew along riverbanks. Butternuts appear at northern sites, far beyond their natural range. These details matter. They suggest deliberate travel and transport. The Norse were not confined to a single camp. They moved south, likely into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and present-day New Brunswick. But this was not settlement. There are no farms, no permanent villages, no signs of long-term occupation. Instead, the pattern is clear. Seasonal expeditions. Timber was cut. Food was gathered. Valuable materials were taken north. Vinland was not a new homeland. It was a resource frontier, and it was not uninhabited. These lands were already known and used by indigenous peoples, whose lives were deeply tied to the rivers and forests. Trails existed. Hunting grounds were established. The Norse arrival did not go unnoticed. They were visitors moving through someone else's world, temporary, cautious, and exposed. From the edges of the forest, the land's original inhabitants were watching. Vinland may have offered opportunity, but it never belonged to those who arrived by sea. In the sagas, the indigenous inhabitants of Vinland are referred to as Skraelings. The term is vague, dismissive, and quietly revealing. It tells us less about who these people were, and more about how the Norse perceived them as outsiders, difficult to classify, and ultimately inconvenient. Modern archaeology offers a clearer picture. These communities were likely ancestors of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. They were not primitive societies waiting to be encountered. They were deeply adapted to the land, its seasons, its rivers, and its resources in ways the Norse were not. This was their world, shaped by generations of knowledge. Initial contact appears to have been cautious rather than violent. The sagas describe moments of exchange, furs traded for milk, curiosity balanced by restraint. Two cultures observing one another across a fragile line of misunderstanding. But that balance did not last. Illness followed. Milk, unfamiliar to indigenous bodies, may have caused sickness. Fear of poisoning likely spread. Trust collapsed quickly, and once it did, interpretation hardened into suspicion. From that point forward, coexistence became unstable. Small misunderstandings carried disproportionate weight. Neither side possessed the cultural framework to repair the breach. Conflict, then, was no longer a matter of choice. It became an inevitability shaped by fear, difference, and the simple reality that two societies were competing within the same fragile space. The Norse did not arrive in Vinland unprepared. They carried iron weapons, reinforced shields, and ships designed for both ocean crossings and coastal raids. In open confrontation, their technology gave them an advantage that few societies of the time could match. But technology was only one side of the equation. The indigenous peoples they encountered possessed strengths of a different kind. They moved quickly across familiar terrain. They knew the forests, rivers, and seasonal patterns with an intimacy the Norse could not acquire in a single generation. Most critically, they were numerous, and they could draw upon networks of kin and alliance that extended far beyond any single encounter. The conflicts that followed were not large battles. They were brief, violent skirmishes, shaped by surprise and proximity. The sagas record sudden attacks, arrows launched from concealment, and a Norse leader killed by a single wound. Another expedition ended, not in victory, but in withdrawal. These encounters carried a clear message. Despite their weapons and ships, the Norse were operating at the far edge of their world. Every loss mattered. Every injury weakened a settlement already isolated by distance and weather. And the Norse understood something essential. They were outnumbered beyond recovery. No reinforcements would arrive. No second wave would follow. At the edge of the known world, even strength had limits. This is the question that refuses to disappear. If the land was rich, the climate manageable, and the resources real, why did the Norse not remain? Vinland offered forests unlike anything in Greenland, timber for ships, land capable of sustaining life through winter. On its surface, it appeared to solve some of the very problems that had driven Norse expansion westward in the first place. But Vinland existed far from everything that truly mattered. Greenland itself was fragile, sustained only through careful balance and constant connection. Europe remained the center of economic gravity. Trade routes defined survival more than territory ever could. Prestige came not from distant land holdings, but from access to markets and from commodities like walrus, ivory, that could be exchanged for iron, grain, and status. Vinland offered abundance, but not integration. It sat beyond the web of relationships that gave Norse society coherence. There were no established alliances, no dependable supply lines, no guarantee that seasonal return voyages would remain possible year after year. Distance transformed every risk into something larger. Conflict could not be reinforced. Failure could not be absorbed. A single bad season could undo everything. In the end, Vinland did not fail because it lacked value. It failed because value alone was not enough. What the Norse needed was stability, connection, and predictability. Vinland offered none of these. The site at Meadows was never intended to become a town. Nothing in its layout suggests permanent settlement. There were no cultivated fields, no evidence of livestock pens, no signs of long-term structural modification or generational repair. Instead, what emerges from the archaeology is a different purpose. The site functioned as a working base. Workshops dominate the space. Areas for carpentry and boat repair appear carefully planned. Iron production was carried out on site, not as an industrial endeavor, but as a practical necessity for maintenance and toolmaking. Leadership halls provided coordination and temporary habitation, not domestic continuity. This was a place designed to support movement, not permanence. Meadows functioned as a forward base at the edge of the known world, a seasonal node where crews could rest, repair ships, and prepare for journeys farther south. It was a point of departure and a point of return. Tree ring dating has since anchored this interpretation in time. Wood cut in the year 1021 confirms Norse presence with remarkable precision. They were here. The evidence leaves no doubt. But the evidence also points to brevity. Meadows was occupied long enough to function, and no longer. It was not abandoned in collapse or catastrophe. It was simply left behind once its purpose had been fulfilled. The legacy of Norse contact with North America is quiet, almost imperceptible. There are no monuments, no surviving colonies, no continuous line of influence that reshaped the course of either world. Yet traces remain. Recent genetic studies suggest that a small number of modern Icelanders may carry ancestry linked to indigenous peoples of the Americas. The signal is faint, but difficult to dismiss. It implies that human lives, not just goods or stories, crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Archaeology echoes this subtlety. Copper artifacts appear far beyond known Norse sites, hinting at exchange networks that moved materials across vast distances. These objects do not announce conquest or domination. They suggest contact brief, uneven, and deeply limited. What emerges is not a story of transformation, but of encounter. People met. Goods changed hands. Knowledge was glimpsed, then lost again. The oceans were crossed, but not bridged. And then, remarkably, nothing followed. No Norse colony endured. No indigenous society was fundamentally altered by Norse presence. The contact left no lasting political structure, no sustained economic system, no shared future. History did not pivot. It simply continued along its separate paths. Vinland, in the end, became a moment rather than a movement, a connection made and then released, leaving behind only the faintest shadows in bone, metal, and memory. The Norse reached North America. They saw it. They measured it. And then they chose not to take it. This decision stands apart in the long arc of human history. Expansion usually does not pause once a threshold has been crossed. When new land is found, it is claimed, defended, and absorbed often, regardless of cost. Vinland followed a different logic. The Norse did not misunderstand what they had encountered. They recognized the value of the land. They tested its resources. They assessed its risks. What they discovered was not impossibility, but imbalance. Every advantage came with a counterweight. Resources existed, but security did not. Distance offered opportunity, but demanded isolation. Presence required commitment that could not be sustained. This was not retreat born of fear. It was withdrawal shaped by calculation. The Norse understood that survival depended not on what could be taken, but on what could be held. Vinland could not be held. It lay beyond the structures that gave their world meaning, trade, kinship, reinforcement, continuity, and so they left. In doing so, they offered a rare historical example of restraint, a moment when expansion met resistance and paused not because it was impossible, but because the cost outweighed the meaning. History remembers conquest easily. It rarely remembers the wisdom of walking away. So what if the Vikings did not fail in North America? What if they succeeded in realizing that some frontiers are not meant to be held? Their brief presence reminds us that history is not only shaped by conquest, but by restraint, by decisions not taken, by ships that turned back. In the shadows of prehistory, silence can be just as powerful as empire. If the first Europeans could walk away from a continent, what does that say about how we define discovery? And what other moments in deep history have been forgotten not because they were small, but because they ended quietly?